Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Composer's Cut podcast. I am your host, Mathew. I'm a composer and cellist based in Chicago, and in this episode, I sat down with the composer-saxophonist and co-director of the Wet Ink Ensemble, Alex Mincek. I've learned so much about many different topics from Alex about the role of repetition in music, about psychoacoustics, about perception in general. And in this conversation, we talked about these various things, but we also talked about specific works. I asked him about a recent piece he wrote for the Wet Ink Large Ensemble, which I'll leave a link to in the description so you can check out. And I asked him about the genesis of the idea for that piece, how he thinks about form in that piece, the role of scales in the work. And so we really dig into the nitty-gritty details and sort of the nuts and bolts as much as we can in the context of an audio-only podcast. Obviously, we don't have the score to look at, but we do get into a lot of details in the work, and it's very fascinating, how he's approaching it on a formal level and how certain ideas emerge over the course of the piece. We also talked about his piece Pendulum XI for string quartet and electric guitar, which I heard recently in Chicago. There's going to be a studio recording of this piece coming out soon with Mivos Quartet and Nadav Lev on electric guitar, so definitely keep an eye out for that. I'm really excited to be sharing this talk with you. This was a really fun chat with Alex. I always enjoy talking with him and learning from him. He's one of my favorite composers, and so without further ado, here's my conversation with Alex Mincek. So I was listening to your piece, this morning. It's really fascinating, and I'm really curious about a lot of different aspects of this. First, like the genesis of the idea. I remember we talked about this in the past, and I know that you said that sort of like, process of triangulating what the core idea was kind of messy. And so I'm interested in the messiness of like finding the core idea of how that piece opens. Maybe we can start with that, and I can sort of like ask other questions that make sense.
Sure. Yeah, well, it is complex. Let me first say that piece was originally meant to function as a prelude for an opera that I was working on. And the opera still kind of exists, but it became a casualty of COVID. So there was going to be a big workshop in like the April of 2020 to really ground where how to like tie that bigger project all together. And then COVID happened and that fell apart. So I spent a lot of COVID then composing point as a kind of then abridged version of the whole, just, a kind of instrumental suite of a lot of the operatic parts. So for me, it's a very cohesive piece, but it darts around in a lot of different kind of musical terrains. So that's partly what's going on. Maybe most specifically about the beginning, though, because to give you an idea of how it kind of embodies a lot of the operatic aspects. I was still writing for this opera. I was writing a lot of the kind of music, speech to dictation kind of stuff on the Mac, and so just feeding in lots of different texts, both like comprehensible and various types of gibberish to get certain sounds out of the computer. And one of them, when you just write a period, like the grammatical punctuation, if you do it in a French dialect, it would just say point. It would read it. so I created this text, which was all just punctuation. There were no letters. It was just punctuation. And I got this one because you can kind of customize in my old MacBook. You could customize the text settings, and I customized this French accent, and it was just this voice saying then like and then I just
Nice.
orchestrated that because that was going to be the end of that was in the final scene of the opera, was this voice coming in and just going and it was going to be, there was all this blips and stuff of orchestration. So I just moved that to the beginning of the prelude as well, so that in the larger work there'd be this, I think, like real memory moment, because it's the only time from the very opening of the prelude to the very end of, like, I'm guessing was going to be about an hour and a half to 2 hour work, that point would come back. And it was completely instrumental in the opening with these kind of resonant tubes, and then, electronic music at the end. So I mean, I don't really fully answer your question, but that's a little bit of the genesis of that piece.
Right, and that's so interesting. I know that like in Glossolalia, you also were using this sort of like speech to or text to speech with a MacBook and having sort of like fun with creating unpredictable outputs with the
Mhm.
Mac. And so it's interesting that it originally was part of a larger work, an operatic work, and when I was listening to it, I was sort of noticing the episodic nature that you were referring to. And it does feel very cohesive for a lot of reasons. One of the things that I'm really fascinated with in particular is like I guess because it is a prelude of a lot of different kinds of materials, and it sort of like explores all of these different terrains. Um, there are certain objects that seem to be put under a microscope.
Mhm.
For example, like one of the things that I noticed, like one of the big moments in the first, the end of the first section is this big glissando downwards into like the low register. And the first time I heard that, that was kind of a mind-blowing moment and then like a masterclass for me in composition of taking something that appears mundane and superficial and using that as a model for form. And so there are these like small glissandi that happen like in violins and brass. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that approach to form and how you think about, I don't know if you're thinking about it like in these terms of putting it under the microscope or something like that, but I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, well, I would start again with just this idea of a blip. So this point, this period, this point. Well, when I started orchestrating that, well, first in the dictation, it's static, so it's just I think it's either an E flat or an F that just repeats. But then it occurs to me in just a lot of my music making or like coming up with structures that are bigger than just an impulse. It's often a simple additive process, meaning there's a blip, and then what happens if you add a blip after that and a blip after that, and then there's some decisions to make. Is the blip after the first blip go up or down or stay the same, or does it leap, or does it get louder, does it get softer? So there's all these different contours one starts to make just connectively adding impulses. So that's what you hear in the opening as well, is not just the steady static kind of addition of a blip structure, but deviations up and down. And then the stretch then is if these are kind of granular versions of a structure, you could make a more continuous version of that structure too. So that's where the little like 4-note pattern, point, 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 but it's a scale up and then a scale down. And as you mentioned, there's also I think the first glissandi is just a viola glissando of a major second. So those to me are all the same structures. They're just in greater kind of definition. So the gliss being like a high definition version of the more grid-like scalular gesture. And then those things then become formal things like you mentioned. So and often like big cadential kind of moments as well to hopefully draw attention retroactively to the connection with the little structures. So I think form is so fascinating because if you're not the composer and you're listening to the piece, you're always recognizing the form retroactively. You don't know what part you're in until
Right.
you're out of it. And so it's this constant game of catch up that a listener is playing with a piece. So I try to make these big cadential moments pretty meaning bearing so that you really like, oh, why is there a huge gliss here? And then you might start making connections that we're both leaving this space and you might reflect on what just happened there.
Right, and I've definitely sensed the cadential nature of like that, especially the big glissando into like the low register. And it seems that there were moments that were sort of foreshadowing it too, like low, like floppy string sound, and then
Yeah.
like super low. I don't know if it was like a contrabass clarinet or something like that. Just like super low register, kind of like rumbly rhythmic sound. So it made me think about the how we sort of artificially distinguish between pitch and frequency is like sorry pitch and rhythm as different
Yep.
things, but they're really the same thing. And that piece kind of like made me more consciously aware of that because of I guess the way that you're describing making these relationships between an impulse and a sustain as basically the same thing just at various sort of distances.
Well, you nailed it. So another version of the point, point, point then to orchestrate is to get these almost subharmonic frequencies to happen that are kind of on the threshold between feeling like a rhythm
Right.
or being recognized as a frequency. Uh, there's two pieces by Grisey that I was really influenced by for this. One is the quatre chant. I forget which movement it is, but it's the kind of percussion interlude, which essentially is just taking the orchid, like the previous movement is heading down, 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 and then you think it turns into percussion most immediately, but it's actually just continuing the frequencies, but at the rhythmic level, or the periodic level.
Right.
And then Partials does something similar where the first harmonic section becomes noisier and noisier and more compressed and compressed, to where then with, again, percussion instruments, he just starts. I think he articulates the difference tones between the compressed harmonies for his structures. So yeah, that kind of stuff has always been an attractive idea, is like getting rhythmic structures out of the harmonic vocabulary as well, or at least making some kind of connections between them that one might not immediately get from just the surface of the music, but upon reflection or more listening, feel that there's like a real coherence there.
Totally. I also remember like Tempus Ex Machina has that kind of it unfolds in a similar way, sort of from the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's like super slow in the beginning and then gradually accelerates and then turns an impulse into like a super long sustain, like the second half of the piece. And so those, yeah,
That piece
those.
is a blind spot for me, so I'm gonna go check it out now that you've. I
Oh,
checked it out a long, long time ago, but I'm glad you brought that up because I'll go listen for that.
yeah, that's I think one of the pieces for me that sort of removed the veil from my ears or eyes, so to speak,
Yep.
because I realized that he was sort of alluding to this relationship between frequency and rhythm as like essentially the same thing, which it is. I mean, frequency is a rhythm.
Yeah.
So that's, that was one of the big lessons for me. And listening to your piece, I really get that. I'm also interested in this idea that you talked about scales, sort of like scales, ascending, descending, or rhythmic scales. And can you talk about the role of scales in that piece?
Yeah. So if you're like me, when the word scale comes up, you might most immediately think of this kind of linear or sequential rising or falling of pitch. But for me, scale is just any kind of gradient path through a parameter. So you could have a scale of dynamics, a scale of timbre, a scale of duration. So da 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 da,
Right.
that's a scale. That's a scale. So that's a scale. So just scale is for me just gradient, a kind of linear gradient forming. Um, so that's going on through the piece as well. And sometimes it's convoluting and sometimes it's concentrating, meaning sometimes it's isolating one of these types of scales. More often than not, though, just off the top of my head, there's usually always something that's being convoluted with something else. Uh, but that's how I'm thinking of scales.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it relates to this idea of like the glissando downwards and slowing down. It's just
Yep.
it's both simultaneously descending in pitch and also in rhythm.
Yeah, and then I'd say just one other scale thing that's happening in that is this kind of scale of comprehensibility, which again sort of goes back to the opera idea, which is when you take things that happen linearly in a kind of relationship of proximity that makes them seem like a whole. So sorry, that's convoluted. Like when I speak a sentence, that's a bunch of different structures, but it's with those words are all in a kind of durational proximity to one another that we're able to comprehend what I'm saying.
Right.
But if I put huge spaces between each of those words or even the syllables of the individual words, comprehensibility starts to leave, even though the only thing that's changed is durational proximity. So but that creates another scale of comprehensibility. So how we're like reacting to those structures. So that's another thing that's happened a lot in that piece, is that just trying to take things that were super obvious, like a pitch scale, blah, 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 blah. But if it's happening at a formal level, like super slow, there's this like rising, it's again nesting these small structures in less comprehensible versions of their like global selves. So that kind of scale is going on as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I also remember once, maybe about a year ago, we were talking about this piece, and you were talking about sort of like periodicity versus aperiodicity. Is that sort of related to this idea of comprehensibility as well?
Sure. And that's a part of there's a part of the piece too where it's like the noise, a lot of the noisier music in the piece is just rendered in a less comprehensible grid of periodicity. It's more aperiodic. It's not totally aperiodic,
Right.
but it's maybe less so. That's maybe again a little bit too on the nose in the piece for me now. But it's definitely part of the thought process.
What do you mean
Um,
by that? Like, in what way is it too on the
I
nose?
just think it's too obvious. It's
Oh,
like, oh, the noisy stuff is and all the stuff that's drawn. But maybe those distinctions need to happen though, where when especially when non-pitched periodicity enters, if you really do want a listener to make a connection to frequency, then then perhaps having really obvious sections of more aperiodic, unpitched music does make that distinction a little bit better. Yeah.
but I guess it's sort of related to what you were saying. Like, as the composer, you're listening proactively rather than retroactively. For me as a listener, it doesn't feel too on the nose at all. I feel like it does add nice distinction. So it's, I guess it also
Yeah.
relates to like your proximity to the piece.
Totally. And also, there's also just these I think just more immediate issues of just contrast in music. Like
Totally.
I love a lot of music that's very monolithic and static, but I also like a lot of music that's just highly contrasting. So this is more one of those pieces for
Right.
me, that it's, as you mentioned, it's very episodic.
I sort of visual. I don't know why. I don't know how if other people do this. But when I'm listening to music, I often visualize a kind of like painting or texture that the piece sort of like helps me to materialize mentally. And I do feel like it's like very kind of like a grid painting, with different kinds of textures and different sorts of like contrasts of value. Um, I know that you also have sort of like painted on the side for many years. Can you talk about sort of the relationship between the visual arts and your music and things that you've learned from the disciplines, and how they've sort of like created a feedback loop into one another?
Yeah, well, that's a really difficult question, just because it could go in so many different ways. Um, I guess first, just like this idea of handling material, like having stuff, like this idea of texture and malleability and transparency and opaqueness, and just having one relationship that is like very physical. So in the painting domain, like having the stuff just in your hands or
Right.
like you're touching things. Um, it's just for me, it's a way of just triggering something in it inspires a kind of relationship with these subjects that don't need to be represented in the musical work, but are rather transferred to the musical work. And I've been trying to think about this, how to put this in a succinct way for a long time, but um, I'm usually not trying to represent anything from the visual world, but I am trying to transfer things, like take a model and transfer like the act of doing, but not necessarily have it lead you to any kind of visual rep or sensational representation of
Right.
the model. So there's a lot of kind of transfer stuff, and that usually happens in um, pretty generalized realms of music making too. Like again, like this idea of transparency, or especially leading to one of my other interests, which is yeah, kind of cognitive psychology kind of stuff, is this kind of unconscious inferences that one can make when you're kind of given a point of reference that then influences your expectations and just your relationship to the other objects around these points of references. So for instance, that could be like a grounding color in a painting, or just various ways of creating creating kind of like beneath the surface coherences. So I think about that stuff. Again, it's not supposed to be one-to-one represented, but
Right.
it's more of like a transfer idea.
Totally. And yeah, so are there specific concepts that you can describe verbally of these transfers that you've sort of worked with between the two disciplines, or things that you think about as you're painting or as you're composing?
It's less to do with my painting. So at least the things that I concepts that I transfer to composing. So there's also just the idea that part of what makes painting enjoyable to me is I don't feel like it has to be tied into my own musical art making. It's a relief from that. It's something because I think a lot of us share this idea that if we're composers or musicians, that we might put a lot of our own self-worth into the things we make, and that can be really empowering, but it can also be discouraging, or it can be an area that leads to a lot of unhealthy self-critique,
Right.
or positive self-critique. But for me, then painting is this domain where I'm happy to just be a terrible painter that has fun making these things. So it's not like when I'm making visual art that I'm necessarily even interested in having it connect. It often does in the ways I just described. But then there's other painters, there's other visual artists that I like that I do think about, again, this idea of transfer. And it's funny because I'm kind of stealing the word, at least the way I'm using it, transfer, from a lecture by an art historian on the work of Ellsworth Kelly. And so again, it gets back to this idea of unconscious inference, which is in a lot of Ellsworth Kelly's paintings, at least by my estimation. A lot of the abstraction occurs when he just takes a physical model like a staircase or a window or an envelope on a desk, and then he removes other perceptual cues. So he might if he flattens that into a two-dimensional space, all of a sudden a shape that when you see it in the three-dimensional space, you become immediately aware of like what it is. But when it's flattened, it becomes this mysterious abstracted object. And so he's transferring one thing to another. But what's important about the transfer is removing or adding perceptual cues that then transform this thing into something new. I think about that in music a lot. How what I'm doing with certain perceptual cues, meaning that could be any number of things. Again, just like in the harmonic domain, like adding a specific drone, an almost imperceptible drone that really messes with one's expectations of how sonorities might be functioning with one another, or just creating a real consistency of resonance such that um, by dint of contrast to that, the idea of space is kind of interpreted in a novel way. There's all different parameters one could operate in that way with, but that is a thought that did come to me through visual art rather than other folks doing it musically. And I'm sure tons of people are doing this in music, but where it landed with me was with Ellsworth Kelly.
Yeah, I remember going through one of collections of his works, and I think there is a specific work of the staircase that
Yeah, that's
is
an
really
awesome piece.
interesting because they show like a side by side, and you're right, like you immediately signify the photograph, of course, as a staircase, but the other object looks nothing like it, and so that's really interesting to sort of explore musically. Again, sort of not like as a one to one as you say, but sort of looking for opportunities to distort one's perception.
Yep.
One thing that I've observed in your music, and I know that you've talked about this in the past, is how to sort of populate time and the way in which you can change how a person perceives the flow of time depending on what is being populated in that space. Can you
Yep.
talk a little bit about that and maybe certain pieces that explore that particular idea?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just as a practice, I'll often, and this maybe ties into the scale question as well. I come up with like chunks of time as a pre-compositional structure. So meaning I'm going to be working in these gradations of, let's say, 16 seconds, or I'm going to be working in these gradations of 4 seconds. Think of this as a kind of like edit scale for how information is going to maybe be articulated. Recently, but what's occurred to me when I was doing that, because I'm writing a lot of music that's often very impulse oriented rather than like let's say lyrical all the time. So what that means is there's a lot of vacant space, or there's like a lot of negative space maybe. And again, this is not a new phenomenon in a lot of new music. There's a lot of music that's these kind of little moment to moment islands. But then if they're islands, it's like, well, what is the ocean then? Like what do you populate that? Or where do you put these islands? And for the longest time, and in a lot of music, I hear that then there becomes lots of like drony elements or otherwise like complex sounds. And most recently, I've found that that's not working for me at all in creating what I want, because if you give people stuff to listen to, they'll listen to it. So, or they will totally shut it off if they think it's extraneous. At least this is how I listen to music. So recently I've been writing really, really large patches of like these islands. So like a blip, and then maybe 20 seconds and another blip, and then 20 seconds and another blip, with nothing in between. And I don't want to say it's silence necessarily, but that's how a lot of people take it to mean. It's just that's how to calibrate time for me now, is don't give any, like literally don't listen, like there's nothing for you to hear. It's like the blip, and then you directly, for me at least, you directly relate with time, because you're thinking about time. You're like, when is the next thing going to happen? If there's that always this underlying kind of interesting noise, it's like the thing happens and then I'm like, listen, I'm not thinking of time. I'm thinking of the interesting stuff happening until the more salient, impulsy kind of thing. So recently, I've been just in my own music trying to strip things down even more to just make it about time, which means just kind of making these buffers of time more perceptible. Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, but
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm wondering is like, do these spans of time remain constant throughout the piece, or are you also playing with scales of these durations to sort of undermine someone's expectation of when to expect the next blip?
Oh yeah, definitely scales, and so different durations, and in relation to, again, just kind of basic parameters of sound, often though resonance. So because I think resonance has a really cool relationship to time in a way, at least for me, both because, well, in space obviously, but you're really, resonance has a very cadential quality to it. When something triggers a resonance, we know it's going to come to the end because we can hear the decay. So there's always, when you hear a resonance that has this kind of acoustic resonance, not some kind of artificial, but or it can be artificial, but you know what I'm saying. I'm talking about a decaying,
Right.
declining resonance.
Like the
It
shape of
always
the
has a
envelope.
kind of cadential quality. So time is already there with you. You're already waiting for it to, you're listening to the demise. And so that the way resonances then start to overlap becomes really interesting to what that can do with time and space. And so setting up like really consistent resonances can, for me, start to then become a point of reference for how you think time is flowing. And it can really distort, again, for me, because this stuff is all so subjective, but it can really distort my flow of time to where if I'm listening to really long resonances, the time span between events can be so long because I just start to calibrate into this like cadence of the resonance, and then that can be really messed with then to any number of kind of effects. So there's another piece I didn't send to you. It's more that, so there's a lot of pieces in the pipeline of being finished, but I don't usually put things out until they're finished. So
Right.
there's a piece that actually got premiered, I don't know, in like 2021, 22, called So Many Ways. And I didn't send that to you because it just got mixed, and it really deals for me, like in a very pronounced way with this subject we're talking about, with resonance as a real kind of grounding point of reference for the piece, and these buffers of time as well. And then another piece that's also kind of older but just got recorded, which I didn't. Oh, maybe I sent you the Mevos piece, but maybe that's actually dealing with some other things. But anyway,
So going back to this idea about endings, like feeling like it's always like kind of the cadence, I'm interested in sort of the way in which you distort, again, sort of comprehensibility in the flow of a piece. And so I know that you've also spoken in the past about how repetition can have this quality where
yeah,
if you suddenly start repeating something, it it like creates an island of that particular moment and distorts the sort of like way that you perceive the flow of like the trajectory of that idea. Can you talk a little bit about that in your music and maybe
yeah,
how it
absolutely.
relates to this idea of sort of like ending, like many endings in a row, or this feeling of many endings?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, repetition is another topic that I feel like seems so obvious, but gets really difficult to really describe when one starts to really ponder it. So it functions in a lot of different ways in my own music and in my own listening to other people's music. Um, but yeah, it's this idea of, for me, I guess the most formal way of describing it, and in the direction I think you're pointing towards, is that for me it's a kind of enveloping mechanism. So from a kind of Gestalt perspective, you could have all of these islands, you could have all these collections of different objects, and you might be grouping them by various proximities or similarities, but you could really break the connection, or you could interrupt how one is grouping simply by drawing a boundary or an enclosure, kind of Venn diagram style around. So like if there's a flock of birds here, and like a herd of goats here, like we think birds together, goats together. But then if I like encircle some of the goats with some of the birds, we would just think of that as a collection because it's got a boundary around it. And that's what repetition often does in my own music, meaning I'm usually not composing loops. I'm usually composing kind of uh, more additive process, and then finding places to disrupt the proximities or similarities within that kind of chain of events. So the fun part for me with repetition is, yeah, it's having composed all this music and then finding how I'm going to disjoint it, how I'm going to like interrupt the continuity in ways that I find interesting, how I'm going to think for myself, like, oh, it's so obvious that this leads to this leads to this, but if I put a barrier, if I put a loop right here, it completely flips maybe that connection in an interesting way, or not. So I'm definitely thinking about it like that. However, there's another aspect that I think is really important about repetition, which is it has a kind of paradoxical humanizing and dehumanizing quality, where there's associations of like repetition that are very much about like mechanical efficiency. I think of a kind of production line, cha-ching, 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 cha-ching. That means the thing is working. So if you hear cha-ching, 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 like it's the thing is breaking. So from a mechanical side, repetition is kind of a marker of efficiency and success. From an organic side, though, it's, at least in my own associations, it's kind of the opposite. So there's a great scene in Existenz, for instance, Cronenberg movie, where one of the characters starts repeating, and everybody's like, "Wait, what's going on?" Because that's a marker for that. That's not how we typically function. If I just there's another scene from The Aviator, again, where one of the characters becomes, he can't stop himself from saying a word. And we take that as a cue that there's something wrong. So that aspect, the kind of extra musical, more, again, like kind of human mechanical, human versus mechanical, or where those things are overlapping is another, I think, thing that repetition can express in a lot of different ways.
It reminds me too of this scene from the recent Blade Runner sequel, Blade Runner 2049, where like they were making sure that Agent K, I think his name is properly calibrated by having him repeat sentences like three times. It's like
Oh, I forgot about that.
I don't remember what the specific line is, but they say something like say this three times and he repeats it three times. And there are sort of subtle cues as he becomes more human, quote unquote, that, you know, he's pretending to repeat the things back, but you know, as the viewer, that he's starting to have more of like an emotional, I don't
Yeah.
know, kind of response to the things that are happening and kind of like starting to rebel against the ones who control him. And so that's a super interesting concept that I guess raises a lot of questions. I'm interested about this boundary idea too. I feel like it also reminds me sort of like of process-based music, like you know, phase music, like Steve Reich and so forth, of where you sort of place a strong beat and where you like the
Mm.
emergent properties or emergent melodies or rhythms or whatever that start to kind of come out. And I notice that a lot in point, because you know, in the beginning of the piece, it feels like the scale of pitch da 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 is like very consistent and predictable. But
Mhm.
like if you compare it to a version of that later on in the piece, it's all sort of like reordered and
Yep.
messed up. Is that a consequence of placing boundaries in different places to distort the scale, or are these coming from a different place?
Um, it might be a yes and no answer, meaning it might be both. Off the top of my head, because I've neglected to talk about some of the other structures in the piece. And so it's often a convolution of some of these things. So you just mentioned this the scale, the ba-da-da-dum. Um, we've described where that came from. But then there's some other like really, I think, salient musical materials. One is wah 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 that is coming all throughout the piece too, which is it ends up being if I were to transcribe that, I think it's um like B flat, A flat, C, F, or something. I could be totally wrong about that if you have perfect pitch. Sorry.
I don't.
But it creates this kind of wedge figure that has a lot of perfect intervals, and I that came again from one of this. I transcribed a line from the opera that is work like voices and music is what the computer program says, but it says voices and music, and I transcribed that. And but then I also noticed that it had this really cool symmetrical kind of pitchy stuff, which was then both a scale if you reordered it, which tied to the scale we've already talked about, but it also had this pattern of dyads and perfect intervals. But then if you kept that, if you were to continue that process, yeah, you get all this kind of like these interesting harmonies. So that is part of where I think what you're talking about is coming from too, is that little gesture and expanding on that process. And without the score in front of me, and I wrote it a few years back now, I'm sorry if that might not be true either, but that's the way I'm remembering it at the
Right.
moment. So
No, I mean that's I guess one of the virtues of memory is the allowance to forget.
yeah, that's why we write it down, right?
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was going to say though is this idea that you were mentioning about like machine operating efficiently is like if it's repeating predictably, then it's working well. Whereas like when that happens in an organic way, like in the human body, it's not. But I wonder if like that's fully true because obviously like if you're breathing rhythmically, that means that it's a good sign. If your heart is beating, you know, at a predictable pace, that's also a good sign. And so I wonder if there are sort of like, I don't know, ways in which that idea kind of translates differently depending on what aspect of organic, I don't know, or human rhythms you're thinking about.
Well, you're definitely hitting on the place where, I mentioned or where they might overlap.
Right.
But I would argue that so those are just narrower margins of difference. So have you've correctly identified areas of kind of our day-to-day lives where yes, we have a heartbeat, da, da,
Yeah.
da, and yes, when we walk, we're doing a kind of very periodic thing. But the margins of difference are that they're not exactly calibrated. They're constantly in flux, and that there's ways that also that they're deviating with just any localized action. Like I can easily slow down my heart rate just by holding my breath, or I can pump it up by running around the room, or you know, um, there's that kind of aspect that I think is maybe just it's the kind of deviations from a extremely quantized periodicity are maybe a little bit different, but you're right. But those things do read to us often as a very kind of rigid form of our own like repetition. So yeah, like I said, difference in repetition is a really complex issue, and yeah, I don't have a pithy way of defining all of the ways, or even really concisely describing one way in which repetition ultimately functions in the way that we perceive this human versus mechanical
Right.
relationship. But
Yeah,
it's
no,
a
I
fascinating topic for me, and I like kind of just sifting through it.
totally. Yeah, I feel like it has many functions, right? It
Yeah.
has this function, as you said, about creating cues for the listener at a formal level to remember, oh yeah, that's the thing that I heard earlier. And so you can retroactively create these sorts of like, I don't know if there are boundaries per se, or if they are just ways of just remembering that this is the same piece and not some other piece.
Yeah.
Um, or creating distortions of what appears to be like a consistent trajectory. Yeah, I think it's not super straightforward, and it's not something that can be taken for granted, which I think
Yeah.
is it often is
Yeah.
from a
We're also
listening perspective.
we're also talking about this a little too hypothetically, meaning like subjecting extremely tenuous physical acts to a rigid form, an aspirationally rigid form of repetition has one kind of effect, both like psychologically and a kind of like stress of the labor that's then I think evoked or transmitted to listeners, versus maybe extremely stable musical structures that are also then asked. Again, this idea of kind of margins of difference comes into play because there's still going to be differences in the stable acts relative to rigid repetition versus the very tenuous acts relative to rigid repetition. But then you could start to permutate all those things, right? So then you could have like very stable acts, meaning just musical structures, rhythms, whatever, articulations that speak in a kind of very, let's say, highly reproducible way. Like if I subject those to vague repetitions, then that's all of a sudden this new like little language. And then you subject the tenuous thing, the tenuous structures to vague repetitions, and again, just all the permutations therein. And that's where things, again, getting back to scales, you could create like kind of scales. I know Bernhard Long has called this a kind of like phenomenology of repetition. And I can't off the top of my head remember his kind of categories, but he's definitely spoken about these kind of categories of repetitions, kind of scales of these permutations of how we can repeat certain types of musical language relative to, again, kind of like stability or labor or um, uh, um, complexity of sound,
Yeah,
etc.
it reminds me too. Like this can maybe the labor one. Are you referring to like having a performer do something that's like extremely strenuous and like watching it break down in real time or something like that?
Yeah, or not even break down. But I mean, like literally having two sounds, like let's say a repetitive hocket between, a flute playing an octave above middle C, so a very banal kind of note for the flute, and asking contrabass bassoon to try to play that, or even a bassoon to
Got
play
it.
that same note in perfect hocket. There's a certain kind of like there's a certain kind of tension in that repetition. I would say it's not a kind of mechanical, safe, stable thing. I think, a palpable sense of there's a kind of awkwardness in the distribution of labor that
Right.
that that Hockett might evoke. Um, So you could imagine there's just so many different ways of playing with that idea of like, there might be a sound that we intersect on that we as composers could like structurally land on as an intersection point. But then you could also just think as like points of labor as intersectional kind of metrics too. Like, I don't know what the sound's going to be, but here's everybody's going to intersect in a kind of banal way of playing, like a very idiomatic, comfortable way of playing, versus a section where now everybody is going to interact in a very strenuous, destabilizing kind of way. And then you can permutate all of those things. So then, or convolute kind of, half the group's going to be like really tenuous and stressed, and half the group's going to be very banal and idiomatic. And there's a lot of fun that then could be had with that, especially in relation to, like we talked about, then drawing boundaries around things that either draw attention to or obscure what direction you might be heading in as a composer relative to those kind of, features of labor and repetition.
Right. This reminds me of the string quartet and electric guitar piece, Pendulum 11, that I feel like there are sections where you're doing that, right? Where like
Yep.
the
Yes.
upper strings are like extreme high register, and guitar and cello are in a more comfortable
Yep.
idiomatic register. So in what ways are you kind of like permutating these things, like in that specific piece, for example?
Yeah, I mean, kind of directly what you're referencing is that there are just times, and this is where I'd have to go into a little more detail with like the score,
Right.
even myself reflecting on it again, where there's something else that can happen. So another way of making the decision. So there's also this, if for me as a avid performer myself, I think sometimes a piece works best when the composer isn't greedy with all the parameters all of the time. And so what I mean by that is, I know if I'm asking for something really Herculean from everybody, maybe I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pick my moments for that. But then if somebody has been kind of hanging out, let's say in a less strenuous way, whether that's mentally or physically, like, now I can find moments in the form where this would be a good time to be very greedy with them, meaning I can ask a lot at this moment. And then if I do that, I might pump the brakes then with some of the other performers, again, to create kind of a balance with just the performance experience so that it's balanced, which I think is palpable in a sense of like when you're listening. I don't want to feel tense all the time. I mean, there's what you're trying to evoke in a piece, but I definitely think as a listener myself, I enjoy when I feel like a piece has been curated in a way where I'm not freaking out all the time for the performers. Like I had to stop watching Olympic ice skating. It's like one thing I just cannot watch because I'm just waiting for somebody to fall, which is terrible. They're doing all this amazing stuff and I can't enjoy any of it because I'm so stressed about, I don't want anybody to fall. And that's kind of like a piece for me too. Again, creating that drama can be really effective. So that's there. But also want people to watch like fantastic things without worrying about, I don't want them to be, I want them to have the time to enjoy it because they're not worried about catastrophe all the time. So that's also a labor thing that I think about that's not as kind of, maybe it's like a different issue than the one we started off talking about.
No, yeah, that totally makes sense, and it's interesting that you mentioned the ice skating thing because I guess as a cellist, when I was watching the performance a couple of weeks ago here in Chicago of that piece, there was a moment when they were playing like for a long time, and I was
Yeah.
like, "There's gonna be a moment when either their fingers on the left hand stop working or they drop their bow or something." I was just like waiting for the other shoe to drop,
It's
and
right to the threshold with them though on that part.
yeah,
And that's a part of collaborative process too. So you are talking about we just did a recording session, and during the session, at some point the cellist and the guitarist are like, look, I've got one more of these in me, and then we
yeah.
have to move on whether we get it or not. Of course they got it, but but yeah, that's what I meant, a kind of like a spot where you could say I was really greedy from a labor perspective. I wanted a certain thing and I had to know if it was possible. The point was not, just so you know, if this is what you were asking, the point in that case is not to break them down. It
Totally.
really is just to get like a really tense, like palpable sense of effort. Like you really feel like they are physically engaged with the material, because the material itself, and this is why I would choose to do that, the material itself is extremely banal. They're just doing da da dee da da dee da 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 da. So this is also a fun thing for me, is like if a material has a certain complexity or richness that I think it might, then I might back off some of the things that would not let you enjoy the richness that I think is in the material. If the material then, though, I find is lacking or is kind of ordinary, but now I might want to add some other interesting thing. So kind of taking, for me, and forgive my part, I mean this kind of facetiously, but I often think of like smart and dumb. So I often think of, in my own parlance, like I'll have like, oh, this is really dumb material. So how can I make it smart or interesting? So I'll take really dumb harmonies or musical structures, but I'll try to imbue them or engender them with like really or some other parameter that makes them special. So
Right.
in that case, it was labor. And then, yeah, kind of do the opposite with all of those things as well. Meaning if something is, I think, really rich in timbre or some kind of rhythmic complexity, I would maybe not want to obscure that with a really almost theatrical level of intense physicality.
This also reminds me of, I was watching, I'm rewatching the first season of Severance because my wife and I are trying to like get to the second season. I don't know if you've seen this show.
I caught a little bit of the first season, and I decided it wasn't for me.
Got it.
Um, my wife is watching it, but there's certain shows that I kind of sometimes get interested in, but then have to back out of because, again, there's I lean towards a kind of stress and anxiety that's kind of always present, and things that then uh,
Kind of
heighten
trigger
that,
it, or
I
yeah,
kind of steer clear
amplify.
of. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this one scene in which one of the characters, and maybe this will create too much stress or anxiety for you, so forgive me if that happens, but one of the punishments that the employees of this company face is going to the break room, which means having to repeat like an "I'm sorry" statement until they really mean it.
Mm.
And so that's one form of like using something that on the surface appears to be banal. They just have to read a screen. But because of the number of times they're made to repeat it, that's what sort of makes it tense and
Oh yeah.
anxiety sort of, yeah, imbuing. And so, yeah, I wonder if that's something that you play with in your music too, is like something that is kind of like easy to do and banal, but like because of I mean, this is one of the things that I thought about when thinking about that concept, is like having to play the cello part in Pachelbel's canon in D, which is like every cello player or bass player's nightmare because you have to play it, I don't know how many times, like
Yeah.
50 or 60 times, and it's the most boring bass line ever. And it's soul sucking because like you listen to everyone else having like a great part. And so, yeah, is
Yeah.
that's, yeah,
No, I mean, um I think about that. Let me approach this in two different ways. So one, maybe some of my older music did this kind of breakdown thing a little bit more. I have a piano piece, for instance, an old piano piece where it's just one chord for a really long time. And then at some point, the idea was that you start just as a listener, even if the pianist is excellently, it's like I think it's an 8-note chord. So they're using a lot of their fingers, but a kind of latency starts to occur no matter what, or at least we start to perceive one again, just because of, even the action on the piano. And but then I started realizing, well, this is really taxing for the performer, which is going to then also maybe enhance this flammy quality of the chord. But then I'll start crescendoing right when it gets strenuous. And I think there's like a program note that I would never do now, but it was like play until you're on the, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like play until you're on the brink of physical, like you might hurt yourself, and then get louder. And which was not meant to be taken literally so much as to communicate that it was about this
right.
thing. I did similar. There's a piece called Nucleus where there's a bongo solo at the end, which is supposed to be repeated until it becomes the rhythmic complexity. So it's just 30-second notes. So it's just da 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 da. But if you do that for like 100 times, you start to get all these like the arms start breaking down, and instead of da 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 da, you start da 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 da, it starts to become this really, and then they can't even like hit the they can't,
Right.
not
The
only are they
point
like,
of contact starts to
yeah,
change
point
and
of
you get all
contact
these
starts to
different,
drift, and you get all this kind of like side sticking stuff. And yeah, so there's some of that in my older music. I'm not doing that as much anymore just because there's a maybe a manipulative
yeah,
part of that that is
where you're sort of on the wrong side of asking someone too much or something.
maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, because here's the thing, I think all performers should have agency to not hurt themselves. And
Totally.
if the musical thing, if the richness of the musical idea can't be achieved unless they break down, then that's maybe where it's an interesting idea, but maybe not one that should be literally taken out.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I haven't done that too much. I'm more interested in finding though thresholds that are just interesting enough where players feel invigorated by the challenge of doing something that's very strenuous, but don't feel like oppressed by some kind of,
Right. Yeah, it's
hurtful.
almost, I guess that comes from being an avid performer, as you said, because like when when you're aware of what it takes to perform something, it's almost like thinking about it the opposite is like a beginning composition student where like they want to give everyone something interesting to do, so they make everything like
Yep.
insanely difficult, but they don't consider that there's a cost to that. And so
Yeah.
it's interesting. I guess the more you sort of like have experience performing yourself, collaborating with performers, you start to sort of understand this balance, as you said, of energy and labor throughout a piece.
Yeah. And actually, to take it in the other direction, I found that I'm really interested in writing some extremely boring parts for just because I think musically overall, so you bring up Pachelbel's canon, the that kind of bass line, I would write a part like that. I've written parts like that for people where they do very little or next to nothing. But I often, those are usually the people I ask to do that are often my closest collaborators because that's where the trust lies. The trust lies in that I'm not trying to either I'm not trying to impress them with some kind of sophistication, either physically or conceptually. It's more like I trust you to know that this is important, um, be, because we know, like
Right.
because we 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 have a kind of trust. So I often find that yeah, like the people the performers I tend to have worked with a lot and really feel like there's maybe a connection. Um, I feel confident to give them very austere, minimal things.
Right.
And also that's how I feel about performing as well. Like when I get a part that is extremely reduced or from a traditional sense uninteresting, I try to just find how to I just think about how musically interesting it probably is going to be because and in a way that I've been trusted not to be um I don't have to there's no kind of flash or pizzazz or kind of exhibition of performative virtuosity, which I think is really cool.
Right. Cool. Well, thank you, Alex, so much for taking the time to talk about your music with me. This has been great and look forward to our next chat.
Have a great
Awesome.
week, Matthew.
Thank you. Take care.
See ya.